Hi, and welcome to Genetics Decoded. I'm Sharon Palmer, your host. Please note that the information we present here is not to be taken as medical advice, really trying to give you a better knowledge base around your health, how genetics is playing a role, so that you can make much better choices. Today, what we're going to be focusing in on is this really important gene called brain-derived neurotropic factor. I want to kind of look today and focus on how your health is integrated, that certain genes or certain pathways in the body can impact across quite a wide variety of your health, and that by going in and looking at a particular gene and making some changes to its function, it can have very broad implications around your health. This brain-derived neurotropic factor is a really important gene and protein around mental health and well-being. So if you're suffering from any mental health or behavioural disorder, listen, because you'll learn something very interesting around BDNF. And if there's any Alzheimer's or dementia in your family, this is an independent risk factor. By going in and supporting your production of brain-derived neurotropic factor, you can really support your cognitive health. And one of the, lots of people are suffering strokes and trying to recover from those strokes, is that your levels of BDNF can help to prevent stroke and also support your ability to recover. So stay with me today as we go and explore in depth this really important gene called BDNF and how it can impact on some really important parts of your health. For all of you listening today, I would expect that most of you are currently under the care of your GP. Unless, of course, you're my father, who goes so infrequently. He goes now when he has to have his eye examination, otherwise he can't get his license. He goes so infrequently that when he went the other week, his doctor said, "So who's your main primary care physician?" And my dad looked at him and said, "Oh, well, that would be you." But he sees him so infrequently, he doesn't even know that he's his patient. But most of you will be seeing a GP on a regular basis. However, if something starts to get more serious around your health, you will often be referred out to a specialist. And a number of you may be seeing specialists. You have a significant gastrointestinal problem that you can't get under control, your GP will refer you off to a gastroenterologist. Maybe there's something happening from a neurological point of view and you're losing your memory and you get sent off to a neurologist. Or your long-term skin condition is not responding and you get referred to a dermatologist. And, there's good reason that we have these specialists. But I think what it also does is we get very used to just separating out our body bits. That someone's doing some work around our cognitive health, someone's doing some work around our gut health. And it's like there's no connection between the two. What this person is doing is pretty much isolated from what another specialist is doing. And genetic research is showing that, our body is truly integrated, that what is happening in our gut can be impacting around our cognitive health. It can be impacting on our skin health. And so we want to start to think of our health under this more integrated model and begin to focus more on pathways and systems and supporting those, and that when we get this right, all of these other factors begin to fall into play as well. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to look at kind of one of these, what I consider to be one of these really important genes in the body. It's called BDNF, it's short for brain-derived neurotropic factor. And what we're going to see is that this particular gene has real impact from a mental health and well-being point of view. And if we go in and look at the statistics now around mental health and well-being, about 20% of Australians have been diagnosed with a mental health or behavioural issue. And that might be around anxiety and depression, it might be around ADHD. But that's 20%, that's 1 in 5 people. If you look within your family or within your group of friends or even your work colleagues and you look at, well, let me pick 5 people, and that, 1 out of that 5 has got this underlying issue with mental health or behavioural disorders, that's quite significant. We have seen a real shift around mental health and well-being, certainly a better understanding of its impact and its incident. It doesn't always mean that we've got a better grip on why these things are happening, but we know that this particular gene called BDNF has a really big role to play around our mental health and well-being. The other area of our health that is really kind of front and center for a lot of people, particularly as they begin to age, is around their cognitive health. We don't want to end up with cognitive decline. And if we look at the statistics, they're kind of alarming because, we are an aging population, but currently the number one killer of Australian women is Alzheimer's. That's the number one. In men, the number 2 killer of Australian men is Alzheimer's. So those are quite high figures. And what we want to do is not be alarmed by those statistics, but kind of look and go, well, what are the underlying risk factors? And we know that this BDNF gene, brain-derived neurotropic factor, is an independent risk factor for the development of dementia and Alzheimer's. And the other thing that can really impact around our cognitive health is whether we end up with a stroke or not. And again, the consequences of that can be quite significant. I remember years ago that I was doing some work in Singapore and I was working with a man and we'd looked at his genetics. And I remember leaving, I flew out of Singapore and I said to him, look, I'm concerned around your health. I've looked at your genetics around cardiovascular and, your pathology isn't great. And he was like, yeah, I know. But, he stood up and he said, but I'm actually really healthy. When I flew back into Singapore a month later to see him, he had suffered a massive hemorrhagic stroke. And I have watched over the last 12 years how he has had to learn to walk and talk. He couldn't even show up from a business point of view. And it's like that's catastrophic for our health. So, we hear the word stroke, but if you've had a stroke and you're trying to recover from it, you realize just how significant the impact can be around the quality of your life as well. And we know that levels of this BDNF are part of what would protect you from having a stroke, but also could play a really important role in how well you recover after you've had a stroke. So we look at these 3 areas. We look at mental health and well-being. We look at, the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. We look at our risk of stroke, and they look quite separate, and you would be seeing quite different practitioners to deal with that. But if we look at from a genetic point of view, we can come down and we can look at this really critical gene called brain-derived neurotropic factor. And we can begin to look and see what is our capacity to produce this protein, this really important protein within our brain. And if you find out that you can't produce very good levels of this protein, it's not to panic and worry and go, oh, that's it, I'm going to end up with these awful diseases. Is that we also know from the research there are things that you can do to upregulate your genetic production of this brain-derived neurotropic factor. So this is really the power of genetics. You can pick key genes that impact on very significant parts of your health, and with very simple interventions around diet, lifestyle, exercise and supplements, you can make a really big difference. So stay with me today as we really go into detail around this BDNF gene. BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. What is it? BDNF, it's a type of protein in your body. It is a nerve growth protein. And these proteins are really important. And that should just tell you something, nerve growth protein. It's a protein that helps you to first produce the neurons in your brain, and it then helps them to survive. And so your levels of BDNF are really important for producing your neurons and supporting their survival. And, we've got lots and lots of these neurons in our brain. They don't exist in isolation. It's really the connection between these neurons that are so important. The more of those neuronal connections we have, the better. And brain-derived neurotropic factor really helps your neurons talk and communicate with one another. This is one of the reasons so important around our cognitive health. We know that brain-derived neurotropic factor is playing a role in brain plasticity, so the ability to kind of change and recover, particularly from, things like stroke. BDNF is also playing a really big role around our dopamine pathways in the brain. If you've been listening to this podcast, you may have realized that a few weeks ago we did quite an in-depth look around dopamine through the enzyme called COMT, C-O-M-T. So COMT is playing a role in the removal and the degradation of dopamine within the frontal lobe. But what BDNF is doing is really playing a role in the release of that dopamine and the pathways. When I'm working at a clinic level, I will always look at BDNF and COMT together because I think you get a much bigger picture of the ability to produce and react to dopamine as well as the ability to break it down. But BDNF is playing a really big role through those dopamine pathways. BDNF is really important around learning and memory. And again, you can see why, if there's not a lot of it around, it could really impact around risk of dementia and Alzheimer's. So BDNF plays these really key functions in the brain and, around how neurons are produced, how they survive, how we react to dopamine. And the thing is, all of you listening will have this BDNF gene, brain-derived neurotropic factor, but the capacity for your gene to produce your BDNF will vary from person to person. What we are seeing is there's about 50% of us, so that's quite a lot, up to 50% of us do not make really good levels of this BDNF. And of course, that then puts us at risk of, mental health and well-being issues around cognitive health, around cognitive decline, around risk of stroke, the ability to recover post-stroke. So if you go in and you look and you go, well, I've got these genetic risk factors, what could I do before I end up with those problems? Or maybe I've got those problems and I'm trying to figure out what the best way is to recover, is going in and finding out what your capacity is to produce BDNF is important. Because as I said earlier, even if you find out genetically you're not good at producing it, there are a whole lot of things that you can do to support that production. So for all of you, you're going to fall into one of three categories around the gene here. Some of you will be able to produce really good levels of brain-derived neurotropic factor. We go in, we look at a particular genetic variant, we see that you've got no risk there, and what that says to us is that you've got very good capacity to produce this BDNF. From a cognitive point of view, that will be a real plus. But this is why it's so important to go in and actually look at your genetics, because even though on a genetic test, that would show up as a green for me around cognitive health, but we know when we're looking at mental health and well-being, that particular genotype still has risk factors around mental health and well-being. So when you go in and look at your genetics, sometimes you can go, okay, this is a real risk here, but there may be risks in other areas or, around, as I said, what we call the normal presentation. You go, well, there's no risk so much around Alzheimer's and dementia, but there's more of a risk around mental health and well-being. And what we know is we can be quite specific around what that risk is. So those people tend to have a much more exaggerated response to stress. They throw off a lot of cortisol. If I know that clinically, then all of my interventions are directed to dampening down this cortisol response. And that will be very different from someone else who has a completely different presentation in that gene. So you will either have a normal, what we call no genetic risks, and you will have good production of that brain-derived neurotropic factor. Some of us will fall in the middle. We'll be what we call heterozygous. We'll have a normal part of the gene and we'll have a genetic risk factor. And those are the people that are producing less of this brain-derived neurotropic factor. And those are the people that will have that concern around cognitive health. And then you get the people who have the double risk. They've picked up a risk from mum and a risk from dad. They've got a double presentation. They're called homozygous. And they will be producing even less of that brain-derived neurotropic factor. So there's the cognitive health aspect, and then we've got what is happening from a mental health point of view. So the people who are not making enough brain-derived neurotropic factor, they will have specific risks around mental health and well-being, and they'll be quite different to the people who have no risk in that gene, who are having the exaggerated cortisol response. Again, I'll be working around their mental health and well-being, but my interventions will be completely different based on what we're seeing from a genetic point of view. And that's what a genetic test allows you to do. You can go in, you can look at your BDNF gene, you can figure out exactly what category you fall into, you can understand where that risk may show up in your health, and then you can go, okay, what am I going to do about mitigating or compensating for that risk? We know that your genetics plays a really big role in your ability to produce this brain-derived neurotropic factor. But your genetics are not the only thing that are impacting here. We see that the amount of stress you're under can impact on your production of brain-derived neurotropic factor. So for all of you who are under a lot of stress, particularly chronic stress, we often kind of go, oh, it's not good for us, but, what can I do? But starting to really understand just the different ways in which that stress can negatively impact, and also why it can be so important to get that under control. We know that your sleep, that the quality of sleep that you're getting, the amount of sleep that you're getting is also really important for your production of BDNF. And again, we've got our devices now. People are streaming, they're watching their Netflix at 2:00 in the morning, and they have to watch the next episode. And the quality and the amount of sleep that they're getting is becoming less and less. And again, if you start to understand the impact that this can have, this is the thing that goes, well, why am I going to change those behaviours? Recognising behaviours is one thing, but making positive changes is something else. But then what you've got here is you've got your lifestyle habits. So let's say maybe you're under a lot of stress. Maybe that's creating insomnia for you. So then that puts you more at risk again of not making enough brain-derived neurotropic factor. But what if you combine that? What if you're one of those homozygous presentations in which you've got very little capacity to make brain-derived neurotropic factor, and all of these lifestyle habits are combining? That's a really significant impact, and it's getting people to understand how that's impacting on their levels of BDNF, why it's important to make these changes, and then putting what the options are around supporting this. Because I think, change is hard for people. Doing something for a day might be easy. Doing that week after week, month after month is much harder. And I always say to people, you can't do everything. Try and pick the things that make a really big difference. And this is where your genetics, along with your lifestyle habits, can pinpoint some areas that just become much more of a priority for you to target and to achieve outcomes with. If we look at BDNF and the role that it has in the body, it is a really big player around mental health and well-being. We can see from the research that your levels of BDNF are playing a role in your risk of things like anxiety and depression, and even severe forms of depression. We know from people who are suffering from schizophrenia or bipolar, their levels of BDNF are important. Whether you've got addictions that you're trying to deal with, whether that be drugs or alcohol or nicotine, we know that levels of BDNF and the genetic variances in the BDNF gene can really predispose us to having these addictions, but where it also may be much harder to get those addictions under control. Very few of us go through life without having some kind of stress or trauma, but our reaction to that trauma our reaction to that stress really varies from person to person. You hear a lot of people who have gone off to war. Some people come back and they've got severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Other people who might have been in very similar situations come back and it doesn't seem to have the same amount of impact. We are seeing that levels of BDNF in the brain can really determine just what our reaction and the long-term impact of this stress and trauma can have on our health and well-being. We know that a lot of these neurodegenerative type diseases, so what falls into that is, Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson, very important to understand the levels of BDNF in the brain if you're experiencing or suffering from any of those disorders. Even our personality traits are impacted by BDNF. So we can see that some people are more likely to be extrovert in nature, other people more introverts. And again, our levels of BDNF are playing a role here. It's been really interesting for me as a practitioner to screen BDNF because what I can see through the different genotypes is we see that the way that we react to our environment can really vary from person to person. Now, we often hear there's a lot of bad things that happen in the world, things that happen to us directly or happen to our families or maybe just in the broader world at large, is that for some of us, we can hear that news and we kind of go, well, that's not good, but it doesn't really impact too much on us as an individual. And then you can have other people that hear that exact same news and internalize it a whole lot more. They almost can't let it go. It starts to really bother them. They can have much higher levels of anxiety, not just around their own health and safety, but around those of their family. And again, we're seeing that their BDNF genotype is really important. I've just been recently working with a woman. We have something called an Elevate program at the clinic. And what we do is we screen things like BDNF and COMT. And this was a patient that just had such severe stress. She had a complete mental breakdown. She could no longer work. And she was going through this process of looking at her genetics because she really felt like she needed to get some much better insight because she needed to get better. And as the job that she was having, it was a very stressful job. She was in a frontline position dealing with people who had really significant stress in their own life. And she was finding it really difficult to separate that. And she had kind of tossed up for a long time as to whether she really needed to completely leave that role or maybe transfer to another role within the company where she wasn't so front and center with other people's trauma and stress. And when we went in and looked at her genetics, the first thing I said to her around her BDNF was that her ability to separate herself from that stress and not internalize it and take it on, she was much less likely to be able to do that. And she just looked at me and she just said, wow, that just makes so much more sense. And then that's when she told me her history around that. And she decided at that point that, when she went back to work, she really needed to be either in a different job or a different role within that company. And again, sometimes we just often think, oh, there's just something wrong with me. I'm just not resilient enough. I should just learn to toughen up and just get on with it. And that's easy to say, but for some people that is much harder to do. And again, when I'm presenting that genotype information to people, I ask a lot about the type of work that they do. Are they frontline responders? Are they policemen or firemen? Or do they work in emergency departments where stress and trauma is almost a given on a day-to-day basis? And some people are much less able to kind of protect and handle that than others. So yeah, that just kind of gives you some insight into how this information can be translated into, looking at our lives and the decisions that we begin to make. Because in some people, we all have this kind of standardized response to stress, but we can see the people where this HPA axis, this hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, is really overstimulated. These are the people that, can be producing really high amounts of cortisol. And what you've got to do is you've got to direct your interventions to calming and settling that part of that stress response down. And people with a completely different genotype, I might not even focus on that area because it's not an area that's at risk. Their risk lays somewhere else. So again, you want to get your intervention right because that's where you get the benefits and the outcome of the things that you're doing. And your genetics and screening around BDNF really help you understand what's happening with stress for different people. If we look at how important this BDNF is, and we know that some people are making very small amounts of BDNF, like what would we do at a clinic level to help to support this? And for people who have variants in their BDNF in which they're not making enough of this brain-derived neurotropic factor, my big focus for those people is on exercise. And, I'm a big proponent of exercise. I say to my patients, you simply just don't have a choice. Like there are too many benefits to just not do it. But particularly for these people where they're not making enough brain-derived neurotropic factor, I really focus on explaining to them the need to build regular exercise into their lifestyle habits. And the reason for that being is that, when you go out and exercise, you begin to stimulate at a genetic level this production of BDNF. You exercise, you begin to make more of this key protein. Not only do you make more of the protein, you are also going to turn on the BDNF receptor. So the receptor is going to be much more responsive to the BDNF. And, it's really interesting at a clinic level. I often see people who somehow have kind of figured out on their own that, when they're under stress or they're really struggling from a mental health point of view, that going out and exercising can make a really big difference. But what I also see at a clinic level, when people are starting to struggle from a mental health point of view, then a lot of the things that they should do, they stop doing. They're like, I'm too overwhelmed, I'm too tired, I don't have time, I just can't be bothered, I just don't care. They stop doing a lot of self-care, and often exercise just is something that just goes. And it's about sitting with them, particularly when they're not in the kind of that crisis mode, and going, getting them to understand how important exercise is in supporting their mental health and well-being. And I always say to these people, when you're starting to get stressed and you're beginning to feel a little bit overwhelmed, that's when you'll probably not only want to continue to do your exercise, but you want to increase the amount of exercise you're doing it more frequently so that you can get the benefit here. What you've got to be really careful of is not just kind of throwing in the towel and saying, I just can't be bothered, is getting people to see that those are the habits that are going to really, really help them through that process. We're finding that any kind of activity is important around supporting BDNF. And then again, you look at some of the Alzheimer's research and the interventions that are being presented to people with Alzheimer's. And what do we see? Oh, it's really important for you to exercise. Well, part of the reason for that being is because now we get this production of this brain-derived neurotropic factor, and it is so important around our cognitive health. Because I always think the more you understand why you're doing things, the more likely it is that you will continue to do them, particularly when things are a little bit hard to do. Like I just got to keep doing this. So exercises are really, really important around triggering the production of brain-derived neurotropic factor. Then we've got some really key nutrients that interact here, and there's a number of them. We've got our B vitamins, we've got and not just a particular B, but we can see from the research that, B12, folate, B2, B6, they're all playing a role. The thing with your B vitamins is your Bs need one another as cofactors. So getting a really good activated B complex is always kind of on the top of my list when I'm treating people. I don't just pick any B because we know from a genetic perspective, there's a lot of genetics around being able to absorb and transport and activate your Bs. So your genetics can go in and allow you to get the exact right combination delivered in the right way. But know that when you get your B complex right, it's going to strongly support your production of BDNF. And what's the risk from a dietary point of view around your Bs is when people choose to be vegans, they begin to strip a lot of their Bs out of their diet. So this is where, again, you can be vegan, but don't let your B intake be compromised through that process. Find a way to make sure that those Bs are coming in. We see that the real need of omega-3 fatty acids, particularly the DHA component. Now, if you're looking from a dietary point of view, your best intake of these omega-3s in the DHA form is going to be your fatty fish, so things like salmon. What do we also see from Alzheimer's research is that the intake of fish is really important. And again, it's because of these levels of omega-3s, the impact on DHA, but then the ability of those nutrients to support the production of this BDNF through the body. And again, if you're vegan or vegetarian, you've often removed your fish or your fish oil. I know people who are vegan who go, there is no way I'm eating fish or taking a fish oil supplement. It goes against my ethical beliefs. And I completely support that. And we can then choose an algae-based supplement for those people. So it's not like you have it or you can't have it. There's always these options. What you've got to know is why it's important to get a DHA source in if you're a vegan. You don't have to go back to eating fish or taking a fish oil supplement, but you have to know that there might be some other things that you need to take that fall within what you consider to be acceptable here. We also know that our ability to respond to a fish oil, the ability to cross that DHA over the blood-brain barrier is genetically determined. So at a clinic level, I can look at what is the best form of fish oil for someone to take. Are they a good or a poor responder? How much do they need to take? So again, your genetics just allows you at so many key steps to get things right. But get that DHA in and get it across the blood-brain barrier, and it's going to play a really big role in you helping to make this brain-derived neurotropic factor. We also see the role of choline and the ability of choline to convert into phosphatidylcholine, really important around the production of BDNF. And again, who strips choline out of their diet? It will be vegans. I'm not piling up on you vegans, I promise. But what I want to know is that we're seeing more and more people adopt these alternative dietary choices. Just make sure that you've got your critical nutrients covered. There's a lot of ways you can get choline and phosphatidylcholine into your diet. If you're not eating meat, you just need to make sure that you're making other choices. Now, as much as people take choline, some people cannot convert it into phosphatidylcholine. And again, these will be people that will need to take it as a supplement. But again, getting that choline phosphatidylcholine pathway supported is important for you making this BDNF in the brain. And then we also know that vitamin D is really important. And again, if you've been listening to this podcast, you will know that not that long ago, we did a whole podcast around the vitamin D pathway. Can you absorb it and transport it and activate it? And does your receptor work? Just taking a vitamin D supplement may not give you the clinical outcome, but you want to get that pathway working, because if you get all of those nutrients either coming in from a dietary point of view, you get the genetic pathway sitting behind that, working in your favor, then you've got this really good capacity to make this brain-derived neurotropic factor. So your diet and key nutrients can be really, really important. And none of those are weird and wonderful, but very key supplementation, key dietary choices can make a big impact around your mental health and long-term cognitive health. There are quite a number of herbs that have a very strong impact on BDNF. I'm not a fan in just giving people lists of herbs and products, because one of my kind of pet peeves around podcasts is that, ultimately sometimes the aim is to get people to just purchase a product. we're going to talk about this, and the aim is run out and buy this product. And I don't believe that's ever the best way to do it. What I want people to do is get their genetic data so they can make better decisions around what they may or may not need. But again, there's a lot of really good herbs that support around brain-derived neurotropic factor. There's a lot of kind of current interest in things like lion's mane, which is a type of mushroom. Now, I prescribe lion's mane we have a full herbal dispensary at the clinic, and lion's mane can be a really key intervention around BDNF, its impact on nerve growth proteins. But why I would choose lion's mane over lots of other herbs there, again, your genetics can help you pick the right one. But some of these herbs are things like lion's mane and Nigella sativa. They can have really big impact around these nerve growth proteins. We know that there's some really good herbs that can really target the symptoms of anxiety, such as passion flower. So again, herbs can be used to, directly support the production of brain-derived neurotropic factor, or specifically target some of the symptoms that people may be experiencing. And then the main things too, simple things that you can do from a lifestyle point of view to upregulate your BDNF is go to bed on time, get some good quality sleep, stop being a night owl, and, really pay attention to stress. Now, I had mentioned to you before that there are some people with a key presentation in their BDNF in which they have this heightened cortisol response. For those people, I direct them to meditation, because meditation can change some of these brainwave activities and impact on cortisol response. So again, genetic information, you can translate that into very specifics for individuals. And that's what we're wanting, is that, of all of these interventions, they're not equal across everyone. What your genetics allows you to do is go, how much of a genetic risk am I at here with my BDNF? And then what are some things that I could really do around diet, lifestyle, supplementation to go in and make a really big difference? And you do want to make a difference here. We started off by looking at the statistics around mental health, around cognitive decline, around stroke, is that, by going in and supporting your levels of BDNF, you can really have significant impact in some key areas of your health. You don't need to guess as to how well your capacity to make it. You can go in and use your genetics and look. And for any of you who are interested at iDNA Health, we do screening around BDNF and a whole range of other genes. What we're trying to do is get you to understand where some of your risk is, and then to make really good decisions to mitigate that risk. And for any of you who really are suffering from a mental health point of view, for any of you who've got family members with Alzheimer's, and my mum is in a locked dementia ward, I'm very aware of just how difficult it is to watch somebody just kind of slowly, they're there, but they're disappearing. And a lot of people who've got family members with Alzheimer's, their own cognitive health is really front and center, is to know that you can be really proactive here. You don't have to sit in the background and think, oh God, I just hope I don't get that. Go in and start to mitigate some of your risk factors. And BDNF is just one of a whole range of risk factors research has identified around Alzheimer's and dementia. So, be proactive around your health. You can really make a difference. Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If we've started to increase your interest around clinical genetics and you think you would like to find out a little bit more, please feel welcome to reach out to us at iDNA Health Clinic. We're proud partners of this Genetics Decoded podcast. It's a real opportunity to get in touch with us and find out how you could go down this pathway yourself. If you liked the podcast, enjoyed it today, please go in and push all the buttons, like and subscribe. It really does make a difference and supports what we're trying to do here. We have a podcast release every Monday, so keep a watch out. All of our topics are around genetics and health, and we would love you to join us every week.